we are going to be looking at inequalities in the decarbonization process. And this is a session really that tries to bring together all those complex inequalities that exist in the process of moving towards net zero. And we're going to hear from a range of very distinguished, very amazing speakers, bringing in lots of interesting perspectives from different elements of the energy, transport, cities nexus, as it were. And really what we're trying to do here is just try and understand basically where vulnerabilities lie, where interventions might be best targeted, how we might drive those interventions. And we're going to be bringing in a range of both quantitative and qualitative perspective from the range of basically from the point of view of policy, from the point of view of practice, but also from the view of quantitative modeling. So part of our speakers, so we're not all here physically, but some are online. So we're going to try and manage that as well. We have some preset questions as well that I've sent to all speakers so that we can start off a discussion. So that's basically our setup. Now, in terms of who's here, so I don't know if I was slightly the lineup that was in the. Well, we could do this lineup. We had a different lineup initially, but we can start this way. So I think that's all right. So our first speaker is Valentine Quinia from the Center for Cities. So welcome, Valentine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, you're not mic'd. Well, can we go? Okay. Right. Okay. Shall we go with a different speaker, maybe? Oh, no one else is mic'd. Okay. It's been a long day. Okay. I don't know if we can, is Michael McGovern online, that maybe we could just, because we have one online speaker, we could just have Michael go online. Okay, it's fine. It's fine, you can do that. I can quickly read biographical details of our speakers while they're being mic'd. So Valentine, who joined the Center for Cities in October 2019, leads research on high streets and city centers and recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. And previously she was an assistant in the Department of Land Economy at the University of Cambridge. So, Valentine, you're all mic'd, everything's good? Okay.
I think so. Oh, yes.
Yes, we can hear you. Brilliant.
Amazing. Hello. Thank you for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here. It's also, I think, the first time I'm doing a real sort of face-to-face conference since COVID, so it's good to be here in person. So yeah, just like Stefan mentioned, so my name is Valentine. I'm an analyst at the Center for Cities. For those of you who haven't heard of the Center, we're a think tank whose sort of core aim is to, broadly speaking, help improve the economic performance of the UK's 63 largest cities and towns, but it's sort of, economic performance in its wider sense. And I lead on the work we do on environmental issues. So I did a bit of work on air pollution and also on the role cities have to play in the net zero agenda. So I'm going to start with the obvious point. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this chart, but because I'm the first speaker, it's easier to say the obvious first. So this is just a chart looking at the progress we've made so far in terms of cutting carbon emissions in the UK. That's a chart adapted from the Climate Change Committee. So the light green sort of trend shows where we've been so far since the 1990s. And so, as you can see, carbon emissions, and I should specify these are production-based emissions, have halved since in the past 3 decades. Which is very good news, but the sort of remaining challenge, so the way to get there to net zero for 2050 is likely to be much more difficult. And that's for a few reasons, but the main reason is that the progress we've achieved so far has been in cutting industrial emissions and changing the way we produce electricity, like drifting away from coal, for instance. So you can see on the pie chart on the top, that's how much of the progress so far has been achieved just through this lens. but much less progress has been achieved in two different aspects. One is transport, the other one is domestic emissions. And so, this partly explains why the rest of the challenge from now to 2050 will be much more difficult, because we'll need to cut emissions in these two sectors where we've seen very little progress so far. And so basically what we've been doing in the research we sort of published in the past couple of years is to try and understand what's in this sort of missing triangle between the sort of dark green line, which is where we are going to if we don't make any more progress, if we don't see any extra change in policy, and the purple line, which is the path towards net zero. So what's in this sort of invisible triangle here? And the question we asked in the research in particular is, what's the role of place? So we know that a lot of the changes we'll need to see will have to be sort of, driven at national level, and will have a very specific place angle to them. But when it comes to transport and to housing, there is a sort of a place angle to this. And the question we asked is, what's the role that cities, because we're the Centre for Cities, what's the role cities are going to have to play in this transition? So let me get the chart. So on these two accounts, cities will have a very important role to play in helping the UK as a whole reach its net zero target. So this is a map that just shows carbon emissions at the UK sort of level, and you can see, well, I think it's just England actually, in England. As you can see, carbon emissions vary quite a lot between places. That's a map that's from a very useful tool called Carbon Place, developed by the credits, I think Jillian, who's going to speak after me, knows a lot about this tool. But in particular, cities are good for the environment, and that might sound like a surprising statement because we often hear that actually urban environments are not particularly environmental sort of friendly. But as you can see, carbon emissions per head are much lower in cities than elsewhere. Now, there's a few reasons for this. One of the reasons, as you can see, is that industrial activity tends to locate outside cities. So, that essentially means that emissions within cities are lower than elsewhere. But as you can see in the transport and domestic front, it's also the case. So the result of that is that a person living in a city tends to emit much less carbon than someone living outside a city. And the reason for this is because of the way our daily lifestyles are influenced by the nature of the built environment around us. Cities have a very sort of specific nature in their built environment, which is that it's quite dense, and density tends to facilitate low carbon lifestyles. And that's quite important because in the changes we need to see from now to 2050 in order to achieve net zero, we know that a lot of changes will need to be driven by behavior change, not just changes that we don't see any sort of impact on. And so that's why it will be easier in cities than elsewhere to get to net zero. So I'll get into the detail of what that means for different sectors, transport and housing. So decarbonizing transport will be much easier in dense urban environments, and that's because density, like I said, facilitates the transition towards low carbon lifestyles. So this is a scatter plot which shows the link between density at the city level and transport emissions per head, and the bubble size shows the take-up of active travel or public transport. And so as you can see, denser cities tend to have lower transport emissions per head. And that's for two reasons. The first is that density means that journeys are shorter, so they require less energy. But density also facilitates public transport usage because it makes public transport much more viable. So it's much more viable to run a bus route in a dense environment where demand is higher than in a sort of scattered rural area. So that explains why transport emissions are lower in cities than elsewhere. And density also shapes domestic emissions. So we know that typical sort of rural or semi-rural housing types like detached houses tend to emit much more carbon than dense flats or denser housing like terrace housing, for instance, which is more sort of specific to cities. And despite this, we keep building too many developments on the outskirts of cities in isolated and very much not very dense developments. So all that also explains why domestic emissions are low in cities than elsewhere. And the same applies, between cities themselves. So here I'm using the example of Oxford versus Telford. So they both have a very similar population size. They have quite a different built-up area and quite a different sort of spatial footprint. As you can see, Oxford is much sort of dense than Telford, which is much more spread out. You may have seen in sort of other research, the usual comparison we do in this type of sort of examples is Barcelona versus Atlanta. That's the sort of UK example for this. And so Telford's carbon footprint per head is much higher than in Oxford's. And that is partly driven by the fact that Telford is way less dense. And you can see both in terms of public transport versus car usage, and in terms of the housing type in both cities, that the fact that Oxford is much denser enables a lot of the population to use public transport or active travel as opposed to people living in Telford. And that explains why carbon footprint is much lower in Telford. So that also explains why we're seeing differences between cities. So this is just a list of the 63 urban areas we cover in our research. Obviously, there's two outliers, which are Swansea and Middlesbrough, which still have a lot of industrial activity within their city boundary, which explains the emissions we see here. But we also see differences between places like Warrington and Doncaster on the left-hand side and Ipswich and Worthing on the other side. So this kind of shows that carbon emissions per head vary quite a lot between different places. And it also shows that the levers that different places will have to pull to get to net zero as quickly as possible vary between places. So in cities like Blackpool or Barnsley, for instance, it's domestic emissions that drive the sort of high carbon emissions. And that's because these places have a lot of old, very leaky housing stock. In places like Milton Keynes or Peterborough, it's mostly transport. Milton Keynes, for instance, is a new town, has been built and designed around cars, and that's very much seen in the transport or the carbon footprint per head of the transport sector. So kind of moving back, now we have this sort of perspective in mind, moving back to what that means for the topic of this conversation, which is equity and how do we ensure we have a fair transition. I think what that means is that it's quite useful to have a place angle when we look at pathways to decarbonizing the economy. And it's also quite useful to essentially move away from a position where we see sort of change at a national level, and to try and understand how different places can achieve decarbonization at their own pace based on their characteristics is quite useful. And I think the lesson here is that not everywhere can or will decarbonize at the same pace. And so that means that we can't have a sort of one-size-fits-all approach for all places, all different territories in the UK. And so not everywhere will or can reach net zero first, and different places will have different levers to pull. And what that means specifically for the role cities have to play is that because they have a greater potential to cut carbon emissions faster, they'll have to play an outsized role in driving the transition to net zero and helping the UK as a whole get there by 2050. And so the point here is not to say that cities are great and that they don't have to make any other effort. The point is to say that because they have a greater potential, they also have a greater responsibility. And so we'll need places like London, for instance, to drive the transition and to get to net zero much quicker than cities than places that are much more rural and in which shifting away from cars, for instance, will be much more difficult. So we need cities which have a very high potential to drive the transition, as opposed to having a sort of national strategy which considers that all places need to get there at the same time. And the other thing that I just wanted to mention before I finish on this point about equity is that meeting the net zero agenda will require mitigating risks, but also sizing opportunities. And that's kind of in two different points. So the map on the left, I can see a map here, but not here, but that's a map of the UK, looks at the share of employment in high-emitting industries in the UK. And as you can see here again, there is a very clear spatial angle to this. And so there are places which will be affected more than others by the shift to net zero. In some cities like Aberdeen, for instance, the share of employment that is in high-emitting industries is much higher than elsewhere. And so that's something for us to keep in mind, in the sense that we know that some places will be much more affected and are more at risk than others of having their jobs being lost or having their industries being disrupted by the transition. And so, I'm sure we'll discuss this later on in the Q&A. But that's something for us to keep in mind in terms of having a fair transition. Just to be aware that not all places will face the same challenges, and we need to make sure that the current spatial inequalities that we have in the UK are not sort of replicated in the net zero economy. And the chart on the right looks at the opportunity side of things, which is a slightly more optimistic angle. This looks at the share of population with no formal qualifications or with low skills, and the share of housing that needs retrofit. And the point of this chart is to show that actually the places that will need retrofit the most are those where the need for jobs and some low-skilled jobs are also needed the most. And so essentially the idea here is that we need to seize the opportunity to create the jobs in places that need it the most for the challenge of retrofitting our houses. I'll stop here because I think I'm probably gone over 10 minutes, but I'm sure a lot of these points will be part of the conversation later. Thank you.
Thank you, Valentine. Thank you for keeping to time as well. I did say to the speakers that everyone has 10 minutes. I should have added. And I think also really good that you brought not just the policy angle, but also a kind of complex inequalities angle, bringing also questions of employment in and all different sort of urban elements into the discussion. So next we've got Professor Jillian Anable, Professor of Transport and Energy at the Institute of Transport Studies, University of Leeds. Her research, very briefly I'll say, addresses the potential for demand-side solutions to reduce carbon energy from transport, and her intellectual interests span the social sciences, and she joined ITS from the Centre for Transport Research at the University of Aberdeen. Thank you.
Thanks, Stefan. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Lovely to be here. I'm going to draw on some research from the other hat I wear. So I'm co-director of UKirk, but I'm also co-director of CRED, the Centre for Research on Energy Demand Solutions. And within the centre, there's been a couple of different projects looking at distribution of energy demands as they currently stand, and the potential uneven distributional impacts of any attempts to mitigate or reduce demand, etc. So I was involved in a project. I lead the, hang on, sorry, got a message on here. I lead the mobility theme within CREDS, and we formulated a project called Excess. So the idea here was that within the research landscape, trying to understand distributional impacts, there is an overwhelming focus, understandable to a large extent, but an overwhelming focus on the end of the spectrum where people haven't got enough resources to decarbonise themselves. They don't actually, they're in energy poverty, whether it's mobility poverty or fuel poverty, etc. And there's a lot of focus on that, whereas the other end of the spectrum, which we have unquestionably got to address and make some very radical interventions with the highest consumers, often doesn't get so much attention. So I'm kind of hoping actually to get you to be sitting uncomfortably rather than are you sitting comfortably with some of the things I'm going to say, because frankly there will be quite a few of us in this room, me included, who are actually in what we defined as being the excess consumer part of the curve. So we undertook both quantitative and qualitative research, and the quantitative research was a huge amount of data and analysis of secondary data sources from the Transport National Travel Survey type sources, but also Living Costs and Food Survey, looking at both domestic energy and mobility energy from the household perspective. And actually the carbon place calculator that Valentine presented earlier came out of quite a lot of that work. And my main point, I guess, and just in case I don't get to it, I suppose, is that I think we need to frame the discussion that we're having a lot more instead of talking about distributional impacts, but talking about the redistribution of impacts. It sounds very subtle, but I think unless we start to get to a discussion about levelling down, about contraction and convergence, and some really important topics about how we reduce that top end, then we're not going to get very far. So I'll whet your appetite first with some killer statistics, and I could have done this by PowerPoint and sort of bombarded you with lots of graphs, because this information really does lend itself to it. But just listen to some of these statistics. So with respect to individual mobility, car driving, 15% of drivers, 15% of drivers are responsible for 50% of the mileage that's undertaken in cars. These are UK-based statistics. So those 15% are driving twice the national average. So the average is 11,000 miles. So that 15% are driving at least 22,000 miles a year. And if we've done these calculations, they're all in the reports. If you were to actually set some kind of threshold or introduce some form of rationing to try and achieve this redistribution, that if you set a car the threshold at that 11,000 miles level, it would remove a quarter of all car miles driven. So that's how many miles are above that threshold. So if you exclude aviation for the moment and you carry on just looking at all of surface travel, it's just 2% of trips that are undertaken that are responsible for 35% of car miles. So just 2% of trips. So when we talk about mobility in particular and the solutions, we focus a lot on public transport, we focus a huge amount on active travel. Those modes, by and large, are going to do something for the shorter and some of the medium-length journeys, but not for these 2% of journeys, which are the long-distance trips that account for a third of the miles, and you can use that as a proxy for carbon. And this is why, just before the session started, quick chat, and I gave the example of where in the Netherlands, where 29% of trips are bicycled compared to 2% here, or 8% of distance over there compared to less than 1% of distance over here is done by bike. In the Netherlands, their per capita carbon emissions from personal mobility, just from the personal mobility part, is higher than it is in the UK, even though they do that amount of cycling. And that's because their longer distance journey end by car and by a slightly larger car fleet and heavier car fleet than we have over here is done by car. It just sort of eats in or overcompensates for all the local journeys that they do. And why? Because yes, it might be much more convenient in the default mode to walk out of their front door and be able to walk and cycle, and they have, you know, they'll be on the top of a league table of accessible transport, of more equitable types of infrastructure and the way of configuring their cities. So it might be more convenient and more equitable in that sense, but nothing has actually been done to restrict motoring. You know, there's no real pricing, they still build roads, they have lots of them, etc. So they're not addressing that top end. And then just to carry on with the killer stats with respect to adding in aviation, it is the case that in the UK we fly more per capita than the Dutch do. So if you add the total mobility picture in, then it starts to even out a bit more. But if you include aviation, then just 3% of trips that we do in the UK are responsible for 60% of the miles that we travel and 70% of the emissions for transport. So 3% of the trips that we do are responsible for 70% of the emissions from travelling on average. And half the population don't fly in any one year, and 15% of people are responsible for 70% of flights. So lots of stats there, but you're getting the general picture. Now, when we did all this analysis, you can't get away from the fact that it's going to confirm a lot of what we know already, in the sense that it's structural and spatial explanations that provide the explanations for these inequalities. And we know, of course, that this all correlates with income and wealth, so that those with the highest ability and capacity and agency to change are also those who consume the most. So that ought to be a positive, right? So you know, let's try and look at the positive. But the increases in energy that are happening are mostly at the mobility end and the consumption end, not so much at the domestic energy end. So the stuff that's often in the too hard to tackle box. And also, just to contrast transport and mobility energy, there is less variation by income with respect to domestic energy demands. And we talk a lot about fuel poverty with respect to domestic energy. That variation in income, the difference between the haves and the have-nots, is much less, much lower than it is for mobility. So that problem in mobility, that redistributional problem, is actually much, much more challenging. We did a lot of qualitative work as well. So we managed to find, it wasn't easy, and they're not easy to engage in research, but we managed to find some of our top 10, 15 percenters with respect to domestic and mobility energy consumption combined. And we also ran deliberative workshops with a mixture of people across the spectrum. And it's really difficult to summarise those findings with any killer stats, of course. But we really wanted to hear, for the interviews going into these homes, we really wanted to hear the interviewers, in their own words, what they're doing with respect to consuming, and sort of why they're doing it. You know, what is it that they're really holding so precious, and what do they think is tying all of this consumption together? So this is where I'm wondering whether it might sort of make some of you in the room squirm. I've done my squirming already, so I'm all squirmed out here, but let's see. So what I'll do is I'll describe, this comes from the research, some of the common elements of the homes and the lifestyles that people who currently fall into this excess consumer pot. And it goes something like this, so see if you relate to it. So if you've got a home with a conservatory or an extension, especially an extension that was there to create perhaps an open plan area, an L-shaped kitchen maybe, with an island in particular, if you've got both a big oven and maybe a smaller oven, or if you've got an Aga, plus maybe a microwave and a 5-ringed hob. If you've got a coffee machine, an American-style fridge or a large fridge, plus a freezer, mostly. You might have, or aiming for, underfloor heating and zonal control heating. You might, think that that's a good thing. And possibly your central heating is supplemented by a wood burner, just for those cozy winter evenings in. You've got music piped into most rooms. You've got a home office, maybe even 2 home offices, but in that home office, you might even, if you're living with someone, you might have 2 PCs and a printer. And your children are likely to have their own rooms, and possibly even a room with a TV, sort of a TV cave, multiple iPads and phones, etc., going around, gaming consoles, etc. And so effectively, you'll have a space which is, if it's not large, it's got multiple consuming areas in it, aspirations to expand it, doubling up of infrastructures generally across the family, across the household, and some oversized appliances in that. And the description of your location will probably match a lot of estate agents' descriptions of, nice, leafy, professional areas, good train connections, very important. Actually, perhaps you might not admit to it, but good connections to an airport is actually secretly really quite important. And you're probably aspiring to expand, either expand that home or perhaps even get a second home, have a bit of rental income for your retirement. etc., etc. So that's all very provocative and controversial in some circles to really be pointing to those things. But they are the common elements, whether it's in the stats or whether it's in just talking to people about what that consumption is all about. The thing is that when we spoke to those people, one of the most shocking things really, or at least you can't get away from it, and you want to be able to move it and sort of untie this knot, but you just can't move past it, is that the majority of people felt that they're already doing everything they could to save energy. And in practice, that meant replacing light bulbs, switching lights off, not using tumble dryers in summer. But the common thing to note that is noticeable across the narratives is that people translated the sort of climate change actions into, and the sort of the environmentally friendly actions into consumer choices. Everything that was an action was a further consumer choice, and that's the nub of the problem, obviously. So whether it's AAA rated white goods, having a good thermostatic control, etc., all involves buying something and having extra comfort in order to be able to tackle this. In the workshops, when we looked at the various approaches that were available, we put the approaches in these 4 different buckets, but allowed people to sort of be creative from there. But we had behaviour change, so informing, educating, persuading people, structural changes, so providing better options, infrastructure options, etc., rationing, and economic incentives. And it was really clear across the groups, structural change was seen by far the most acceptable and reasonable approach, because it was about the government taking responsibility, creating a level playing field for everyone, making climate-friendly choices available. Everything that we talked about came down to needing choice within it. So even rationing needs to have an element of choice within the rationing. People can sort of discern some of their own routes of spending the ration in order for it to be acceptable. But economic incentives were also seen as necessary. However, the whataboutism, the sort of discourse of denial, which is whataboutism, what about these people, came through very strongly. Other people's idea of what's fair, the fact that many people wanted to point straight away to the fact, well, there are people that aren't going to be able to pay. Instead of saying, okay, we can pay, it was straight away pointing to people that won't be able to pay. And many of the more wealthy deliberators stressed that people could be or should be incentivized to do the right thing. So there you have people who are already sort of quite wealthy and self-interested, wanting to have their own self-interest appealed to in order to be able to change. And so finally, then rationing was the least popular approach. But interestingly, it was seen as ruthlessly fair. And I think this is quite interesting because most of the research you do looking at behaviour change and propensity to change and acceptance of policy correlates that acceptance with the idea that something must be incredibly, they must have trust and they must see the policy as fairness. So here we found, at least qualitatively, as you can imagine, a very strong reaction against rationing, even though it was deemed and accepted as being the fairest way to do things. And as I said before, the only way really that people came round to the idea of it being fair was to start to think about different ways of designing a rationing system that allowed quite a lot of choice and agency within that system. Behaviour change was seen as wholly ineffective. So there's a lot in there, not many solutions I appreciate. I would, If you're interested, obviously urge you to go to the reports. There are 3 reports. One is very much about the metrics, how you might define excess, and some of the killer statistics that we've talked about. And one is a report on the qualitative findings, and the other is starting to put the 2 together and think about the some of the solutions in these four different brackets. But I certainly would be interested through the discussion to just explore whether you think that there is a need to start to reframing is too much of an overused word, but start to make sure that we actually focus on this higher end as a way of actually being able to address some of the issues around poverty that we're seeing at the other end. Thanks.
Brilliant, and thank you, Jillian. Thank you particularly for bringing in that element that we rarely think about, which is the element of affluence, rather than when we think about inequality, rather than deprivation. And it's always so fun to hear about the Excess Project and what it materially translates into. Now, because our next speaker, I think, is online. So there he is. Right, brilliant. So that would be Michael McGovern, who is an economic... Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Brilliant, yes. An economic modeler in Cambridge Econometrics. Recent projects include research into the EU's dependency on oil imports and the impacts on a UK recovery on the COVID-19 pandemic. So, Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Hi, everyone. As Stefan just said, my name is Michael McGovern. I'm an economist, economic modeler at Cambridge Econometrics. We're an economic consultancy specializing to a large degree in looking at the economic impacts of the clean energy transition. We work on other subjects as well, but that's one of our main focuses. And today I'm going to discuss briefly a study that we recently conducted or are soon to complete as part of the CREDS FAIR project. So this is the same CREDS that Jillian was just mentioning in her intervention just now. And whereas Jillian is leading the mobility theme under the CREDS banner, our project was under the FAIR theme, which is a sort of acronym referring to fuel and transport poverty, looking at the net zero transition under that lens. So I'll briefly run through the study, what we did, and the results from that, but I won't dwell too much given the time constraints on too many technical details about that, and try and focus on what the key takeaways are for our purposes. So very quickly to give an overview of what we were looking at and how we approached the study. So the research question we were aiming to answer was, how will the net zero transition affect vulnerability to fuel and transport poverty? This is in the UK specifically. And the approach we took was to use, first of all, our in-house economic model called E3ME, which is an E3 model standing for, which covers the interactions between the economic system, the energy system, and the environmental outcomes from emissions. And using this model to look at 3 scenarios, analyzing different alternative UK net zero pathways. So the first of these was an attempt to sort of replicate the policies that were outlined in the UK's net zero strategy, and try and replicate that and see what the outcomes were. And the other 2 pathways, the other 2 scenarios, were looking at sort of alternative policy packages to reach net zero that were, the idea was to be quite contrasting. So one of them was focused on regulatory measures, and the other both focused on market-based instruments, which is to say a carbon price covering the whole economy, and only a carbon price is the idea. And so we conducted this modeling analysis of these 3 scenarios and looked at the model outcomes in terms of economic outcomes and outcomes on the energy system, and used these outputs from the E3ME modeling as inputs into the second stage, which was an assessment of the impacts of these scenarios on household energy bills, and looked at through the dimension of different household archetypes, which we developed, and looking at what the costs and benefits would be for those different households. So I'll start with a brief look at what the sort of main outcomes, the key outcomes were from the E3ME modeling. So you can see on the left there is a sort of projection of the scenario emissions reductions. We have a baseline in black, which has some degree of emissions reductions out to 2050. And the other three scenarios, we would compare the differences to baseline is the idea, to see what the impact of the additional policies would be compared to a business as usual situation, which is what the baseline represents. And so you can see that the net zero strategy is in a sort of light green color. The emissions outcome by 2050 is slightly higher in terms of the quantity of emissions than the other two scenarios, because that was a sort of finding of the study that the policies in the net zero strategy were not quite sufficient to achieve what we would think of as a net zero compatible outcome, whereas the other two scenarios were closer to zero emissions from energy and industrial processes once CCS is taken into account, and not quite zero, but within range of net zero once other emissions removals are taken into account. And on the right, you can see some of the key outcomes from E3ME in terms of the share of technological capacity. In the top graph, I'm not sure how clearly you can see it where you're sitting. For me, it's a little bit blurred, but the top graph represents heating technologies for gas boilers are represented in red or pink, and heat pumps are represented in the sort of turquoise color, and electric heaters in blue at the top on the top graph. And you can see on the left, the baseline is a large proportion still of gas boilers by 2050. Oh, sorry, but I should say these outcomes represent the outcomes in 2035. So the aim of the study was to look at what the impacts of the transition were, as opposed to the end point, whatever you believe about. We're quite optimistic about what the economic impacts of this transition would be ultimately by 2050, but that's even in that case, the transition to that point risks being fairly painful for certain groups. And so we wanted to look at what the impacts were in 2035 as this transition was partway through. And so you can see there's a sort of some uptake of electrical heating technologies, but by no means comprehensive. And the same is true for the graph below, which is looking at passenger vehicles, looking at internal combustion engine vehicles, petrol and diesel in pink, and then electric vehicles in the turquoise, essentially. And you can see that the transition is underway, but by no means complete. And so moving on, using some of these outputs as inputs into the second stage of the analysis, which was looking at household archetypes. So to briefly explain what was going on here, we took outcomes from E3ME in terms of these technology shares that I just mentioned, as well as energy prices for different fuels, and looked at what the impacts might be on these different households. We developed a set of archetypes based principally on archetypes developed by Ofgem in a recent report, and supplemented by data from the National Transport Survey, and had made an estimate of what people's expenditure on different forms of energy might be in those different households cases, and it depended on using the sort of aggregate outcomes from E3ME, which represents figures for the whole UK economy, and trying to make informed assumptions about what that might mean for uptake of different technologies, for instance, in a certain type of household. So these 13, and particularly extending these households' energy consumption patterns out to 2035 from the data, which is obviously from more recent times, and looking at how, trying to project forward how the uptake of technologies in these households might progress by 2035, and using those inputs to estimate what the impact might be on energy bills. And so you can see that despite similar outcomes in terms of the UK-wide emissions pathway we saw in the previous graph, the outcomes for different households in terms of their energy bills can be quite different depending on which pathway we're taking. So on the very right, you can see the market-based instruments pathway. This is a carbon price only pathway, where the carbon price needs to be raised quite early and quite aggressively in order to achieve the necessary emissions reductions, and compared to a regulatory pathway in the middle, where the impacts on household energy bills relative to the baseline, which is what this graph is showing, the percentage differences from baseline in the total energy bill, including heating bill and transport fuels, is much smaller for this regulation-based pathway than it is for the market-based instruments pathway. Okay, so that's a quick overview of the project and the outcomes. So what are the key takeaways in terms of the implications of the net zero transition in the UK for fuel and transport poverty? As you can see, the focus of our study was centered a lot on technological transformation and uptake of different renewable energy technologies and clean energy technologies, and key questions for these are firstly in terms of running costs. So how will essentially the gas and petrol and diesel prices evolve in the next decades, and how will that compare to how the electricity price evolves over the next few decades? And there's a lot of uncertainty, obviously, on both sides. We're well aware of how volatile fossil fuel prices can be for the consumer, and also there are a lot of uncertainties in terms of the pathway of renewable electricity and the costs of those going forward, particularly in terms of the how cheap storage promises to be, and so on. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these issues, and so in our modeling, it suggested that, well, currently we know that per unit of energy, electricity in the UK for the consumer per kilowatt hour, if you like, is several times more expensive than gas. How will that change going forward? But at the same time, switching to renewable, cleaner energy technologies promises to bring efficiency gains. So heat pumps require less energy input for the same amount of heat produced than gas boilers. And the same is true for electric vehicles. They are much more efficient to run than internal combustion engine vehicles. And so you have these two influences going in different directions. On the one hand, you are switching to a more expensive type of form of energy, that is electricity. And in our scenarios suggested that electricity will be more expensive than gas still in the future, although again there's a lot of uncertainty around those questions. But at the same time, in the other direction, there promises to be some efficiency savings from switching to these technologies. So on net, the question is, what will be the impact on running costs? It's a little bit uncertain, and it depends on a lot of different factors. And obviously, this is an especially important question for low-income households who pay a larger proportion of their expenditure on energy bills, and particularly heating bills. The second question is about upfront costs, which is obviously a big consideration when you are deciding whether to buy an electric vehicle or a heat pump, or invest in even something less fancy, like a insulation for your building or double glazed window. There promise to be efficiency savings going forward, but that's obviously set against the upfront cost, the initial investment cost of paying for that. And obviously those decisions become much easier the higher income you have. And for low-income households, these upfront costs are much less affordable. And so you can see that the impacts of the transition threaten to be quite difficult for these households. If you find yourself in a situation where your running costs, your fuel costs are becoming more and more expensive, and yet you cannot afford to invest in switching to a technology which would save you more money, then you can be in a position where you're stuck. Whereas these decisions to switch to new technologies to save money are much easier for households with higher incomes. Especially at the beginning of the transition, because as we've seen with solar energy, and we're seeing now with electric vehicles, we can expect to see falling technology costs over time. We can expect to see the price of switching to an EV and a heat pump decreasing over time and becoming more comparable to the price of the existing technology. But early in the transition, in the next decade, up to 2035, we can see this potentially being quite a difficult choice, a more difficult choice for low-income households, especially if we continue to see elevated gas prices that affect cost of living significantly for these households. And the third question is surrounds fiscal policy. This is an important sort of factor in our modeling. When we are talking about the measures that we use in our scenarios, obviously a carbon price is a very good example of this. You implement a carbon price, you have more revenues for the government. What do you do with these revenues? Do you spend them again and try and be budget neutral to more or less keep the fiscal balance the same, the fiscal profile the same? And so do you try and spend it out in the economy? How do you do that? Do you reduce taxes? Do you try to provide support for low-income households? These are big questions, big variables, and key issues that we have to consider, and that can't just be in the background of these questions. And the flip side is true for any policies that might, for instance, subsidize the costs of switching technologies. That will be an extra cost to government. How do they pay for that? Is it a question of fiscal expansion, or will they need to raise some taxes ultimately to keep a balanced budget, at least as far as those measures go? Those are important questions which affect the outcomes particularly for low-income households. And so it will have a strong, important distributional impact. And so those are some of the key questions going forward coming out of our analysis, and key variables for policy makers to consider. How do you alleviate some of these costs, and how do you minimize some of the risks to the lowest income households, where these questions, as we've seen over the last year, they count for more. These questions become more and more important, and have more and more implications if you are in a low-income household compared to other households. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Well, Josh is next, actually. Thank you, Michael, for that comprehensive view of basically how energy costs particularly affect low-income households, but also what it means in fiscal terms, and also from a scenario building and futures element as well. So Josh is our next speaker. Last but not least, Josh Burke, Senior Policy Fellow at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment, where he leads the policy analysis team on UK climate and energy policy. Thank you, Josh, for being here. I know you weren't. There was some uncertainty over your attendance, so it's really good to have you here. Thank you. Cheers.
Okay, thanks everyone. Yeah, I came back from holiday yesterday with COVID on holiday and tested negative twice this morning, so I can assure you I am okay, but yesterday it wasn't looking so good. So yeah, thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. I'm going to hopefully provide some solutions to what is a really tricky policy question, but how do you mitigate some of these distributional impacts? But first I want to kind of lay out why this is a really important issue. Obviously there's the issue of equity and justice, and it's a fair question to ask why those who contribute least to the problem should be bearing the majority of the costs. So that's one really important question that we want to be addressing. But the second is around the politics of net zero, and in particular the question of who pays. And those of you that follow the policy debate will probably have already acknowledged that there's a noisy, a vocal proportion of backbenchers who put forward this question of who pays as a way of slowing down the transition. It's a delaying tactic. It's a way of pushing back against the agenda. So the question of who pays is inherently political. So as someone who works in politics, I'm very interested in this question, partly because it's a way of pushing back against those that are trying to delay ambitious action and those of us who are working to accelerate the transition. So that's a really important question, and in fact it's kind of the latest variant of climate denialism in a way. It started with it's not happening, that morphed into it's happening, but it's not man-made. And now the kind of latest iteration is it's too expensive, we can't afford it. We really need to address that because it's a very sophisticated argument. It's one that no one disagrees with, but they're putting it forward for disingenuous purposes, even though it's a legitimate question. So let me just frame that initially. So how are we doing at the moment? Well, not very well from a policy perspective. So this is work from led by Anable at Leeds, who I collaborate a lot with for one of her papers, which I've nicked for this presentation. So this is looking at the policy costs as a percentage of household income. So when fair means different things to different people, but the way we look at it is if lower income households are paying disproportionately more than higher income households, a policy is deemed as an unfair one from a kind of financing perspective. So what we have here is income quintiles, 20 different income groups, and as you can clearly see, the lowest income group is already paying far more than the highest income group. So this is a unfair policy package, if you like. And the reasons contributing to this are a lot of the low carbon policies are funded through a levy on consumer bills. So a lot of the money to pay for these policies is channeled through our electricity bills. And as low income households already pay disproportionately more, this increases that. So we've had a really good situation where renewables have come down really far, down the cost curve in a rapid way through this kind of element of competitive tension through contracts for difference. It's been a really successful policy in that respect. But in terms of how that policy has been funded, it's been funded in a regressive manner because the costs have been lumped on lower income households. So the current situation for policies to fund low carbon technologies has been unfair from a kind of equity and justice perspective. And so a lot of the work that I do personally is around carbon taxation, carbon pricing, and this is the work that we've been doing recently, where we've been looking at how carbon pricing affects different income groups. What we have is the yellow dots, which is proportion of income, which is the proportional spend, and the bars are absolute spend. So you can see that higher income households pay more in absolute terms, but in relative terms, they're paying a lot more. And because the UK has quite an unequal distribution of wealth, you'll see a much steeper gradient for the yellow dots. So typically in lower income countries where there's not quite as big variance in income levels, the yellow dots would be a slightly flatter distribution. So in lower income countries, carbon pricing is less regressive than in wealthier countries like the UK. So this is with the £50 a tonne carbon tax. Indeed, we've got a higher one than that right now. So these bars would be exacerbated. And you can see a lot of the money, a lot of the monetary impact goes on energy bills as opposed to transport and food. And in particular, from other speakers here, we've heard energy costs are particularly regressive because lower income households spend more, as we can see in this chart. So a lot of that cost gets lumped there. And in the midst of a cost of living crisis that we have, any policies that exacerbate increasingly already kind of existing high fuel bills is not something we want to be looking at. So carbon pricing is often quite a regressive policy, but that doesn't take into account what policymakers might do with the revenue, which our previous speaker talked about. So how can we redistribute, as Jillian was saying, moving away from distributional impacts to redistributional policies? And this is where the revenues from carbon pricing or carbon taxation comes in. And policymakers have a choice. They could be really redistribute in a very strong manner, or they could be slightly less redistributive and use less money in that context. So here we have two different revenue recycling strategies. You've got one, which are the green bars, where you're giving a larger proportion to lower income households, and then the grey bars where every household gets the same. So there's a choice here for policymakers using different budget shares, admittedly. So the green policy would use a larger proportion of the revenues, and the grey bars would use a small amount. So policymakers could be, if you're below the line, it means you're a net beneficiary. So actually, with the green policy where you're targeting particularly low-income households, income deciles 1, 2, and 3 are actually beneficiaries of the policy. They're not out of pocket, they're in pocket. They're they're earning money from the policy. And again, there's, even if you're giving a flat redistribution, income deciles 1 and 2 still are net beneficiaries. Now, there's a trade-off here between fairness, if you like, but also the administrative complexity of the policy. The more you start to try and tease out differences in the strategy, so targeting certain groups, the more complex it is for policymakers to administer. So in most countries, there's a kind of combination of strategies of targeting low-income households, and in other countries, they give a uniform, as we call it, transfer to households. So this is something we would advocate. It's a very difficult message to send to policymakers. It's not something they like to do. And indeed, you can see how that is going with UK policymakers. I'm running very quickly out of time. So what we have here is a bar chart showing the different redistribution strategies of countries across the world that have carbon pricing. As you can see, the UK is an outlier. It has no redistributive strategy for its carbon pricing proceeds. It all goes into a general pot, whereas other countries single out different actors in the political economy to mitigate some of this, the kind of backlash. And this is a question of legitimacy, and how enduring a policy framework is likely will be influenced by how fairly it's perceived and how vocal the opposition might be. So countries will single out who they think are the actors that will give them the biggest challenge. So, so in France, you can see it all goes to green infrastructure spending. In Ireland, it's a combination of things. Denmark uses a kind of mix and match way. Some goes into general funds, some is used for green infrastructure, and then some is recycled to households. Now, curiously, it's not an error. When you look at British Columbia, they actually, instead of being revenue neutral, where they give the exact amount back that they raise, they actually give more money back. It's a slightly peculiar policy there, but all of the money goes back to firms and households because they've identified those stakeholders as those likely to give them the biggest challenge in terms of accepting the policy. So we've got a big challenge in the UK of trying to get policy makers to move away from this kind of orthodox approach where revenues cannot be recycled to mitigate policy. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip through that slide. And so I'm going to just talk through some very quick new research that we've been working on, which is the funding mechanisms for negative emissions technologies. So this is a paper that we did initially for the National Infrastructure Commission. We've kind of spun this out into an academic paper. So we've been looking at how do you fund BECCS and DACs and what are the right policy approaches to do this. And so we've kind of constructed 4 different policy approaches that the government could use to fund BECCS and DACs. And we've looked at what that means for households in terms of the absolute and relative amounts that it might translate into impact on their bills. So we have a carbon CFD, which is the orange line, which is your current approach for offshore wind. We have where all the costs for the policy are borne by a levy on consumer bills. We have an approach called the multi-sector government contract, where almost there, where the BECCS hydrogen is funded by the hydrogen sector, BECCS powered by the power sector. So we kind of split it by the sectors that the technologies will produce. Then we have polluter pays, which is those sectors with large residual emissions pay for the policy. So that's essentially aviation and the land use sector. And then we have an income tax. So the distribution is not something it's not new. It's kind of exactly what we expected. What we were interested in is the magnitude, rather, to see which is relatively worse and which is progressive. Obviously, you can see 3 lines going one way and 1 line going the other way. That basically means we have 3 policies that are regressive, i.e. lower income households are paying more. What's interesting is the difference between the 3, which is the current approach for funding offshore wind. If that was moved over to pay for BECCS and DACs, we would end up with the worst situation possible. So we're trying to look at things we can recommend to the government for funding these in a fairer way. Now, what's interesting is the polluter pays is often framed as an equitable policy because it's those who are polluting should pay for it. Now, that's not necessarily the truth in that, yes, it's the least bad of the policies that are politically possible, but it still does mean that lower income households are paying more. And then we just, out of interest, we put a policy in there that we knew would be highly progressive, but politically very difficult to make tracks with, and that's paying it out of income tax. So we just wanted to show that those choices are possible. There are options out there if you want to fund these in a progressive manner. It just takes political will. So I'll just end with a couple of key messages. So the UK transition must be underpinned by equity and fairness. That's an obvious point, but it speaks to the politics of net zero and how to build public legitimacy. The distribution impacts are a political choice. It's not set in stone where those costs fall. Policymakers have it in their gift to change that, as we've just seen with the cost of living budget, which was highly redistributive. That is a possibility if governments and policymakers wish to do so. CFDs, great policy in terms of driving down the cost of renewables, but quite regressive in the way that they're funded. So good policy mechanism with attention to bring down costs, that competitive tension, but we need to think about better ways of funding it. Polluter pays approaches aren't inherently fair, and broad fiscal reform is needed. For public support and public legitimacy, these small technocratic changes, so redistributing the finances, will just be seen as technocratic feeling and not really commensurate with the scale of the challenge, and you can't be done in isolation. It needs to be carbon tax revenues plus other things, and that is a balance between subsidies, regulations and taxes. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you for bringing that political element to the fore, particularly the question around fiscal policy and how redistributive it can be. Right, we have not got much time. I love that trick with the music. I'm going to do that next time I share to everybody, but thanks for keeping the time. Can I ask you to all come up here on the stools? I guess we will have Michael in the background as well. I mean, we've had a few questions come up on Glycer, and there are a few specific ones, so I might just ask first. Yeah.
Very big brother.
Yes, you're glooming in the background. There's been an interesting question for Josh, and there's also been one from Anable, which, I'm going to ask you those first, if you can briefly comment on them. I'm aware that we have Andy Burnham after this, and we're nipping on the heels of that sort of time frame. I don't know if we meant to finish at the quarter of the hour so that starts, so we don't have much time. But for Josh, we had a question around whether the current UK ETS expansion consultation might be the right moment now to talk about framing a strategy for recycling revenues from the ETS. And then for Jillian, I think, and this is maybe something that everyone can comment on, is there an underlying notion that there's an average level of consumption that is sufficient? So bringing the energy sufficiency principle in. And what would the effort be around that? Can we take into account economies elsewhere? I mean, it's a broader debate, but maybe that first question is important. And there was something more specific around the 2% of car journeys that you mentioned, Jillian. Do we know what those are for? So if the two of you can comment on that, and then I will open up the floor for just some more general questions as well, if we have time.
Sure. Okay, I'll go first. I think every consultation is an opportunity to hammer home that message. Yes, this consultation is a good opportunity to looking at the expansion of the ETS to other sectors, which means there'll be more revenue to use. But I think going back a little bit further, the net zero review by the Treasury, which was specifically looking at this question of fairness and the distribution impacts on net zero, that was probably the prime opportunity for us to try and push them and cajole them in the right direction. I think some of the difficulty stems from there's a real, how to say this politely, institutional inertia to new ideas within the Treasury, and a lot of opposition to being slightly creative with policies, and they're very set in stone about how to balance the books. And so carbon taxation and the revenue recycle that follows carbon taxation is quite a difficult thing institutionally to get them to move forward on, even though there's good examples from other countries, like we've seen on the presentation. British Columbia, they do a check in the post. Every household gets a physical check in the post that says, here is your money from the carbon tax, to that kind of to give them the sense that actually they're not being penalised from the policy. There's lots of things out there in the literature on political economy that we could do. that much is fairly straightforward, and the mechanisms to give that money back are fairly straightforward. The difficult thing is getting the policymakers to move on it.
Okay, so is there an underlying notion that there's an average level of consumption? I would say that, I mean, there is work on this, not from the Excess project, although we tried to do a bit of this. So there's the work on minimum income standards that the Joseph Rowntree Foundation undertake on a regular basis, and that is all about defining what the minimum needs are, you know, for a household to sort of live in this society. And there's some fascinating things in there. I know obviously about the travel-related elements of that, and I can't put quite a time frame on it. Let's just say 10-15 years ago, when they undertook the same exercise, it was a car was only deemed sufficient, necessary rather, in rural households with children. Go forward 15 years, do the same exercise, and a car is deemed necessary for everybody. And so that tells us something about the way our lives are configured, and land use patterns and labour markets and all the rest of it, and the structural factors, but it also tells us something about the norms and the expectations that have changed. When we went in with the high consumers to start with and asked them about what it is that they could do without, there was just an inability for people to be able to imagine not being able to live with what they were currently living with. And the only way they could imagine reducing was, as I said before, to consume something else that helped them reduce the energy demands that were placed on them. And all the notions around that were around, all the sort of obstacles around that were around these norms, these expectations, but also a sense of deserving it, of having earned it. So it depends how you ask the question and who you're asking it to as to what these answers are. And then just on the 2%, yes, know very much what those trips are for. Largely, these 2% of journeys that consume and eat into the miles, if you think about your lifestyles or your travel, for those of you who've got a car, I bet this is the case, they are the long-distance leisure trips. So those 2 journeys to the family at the other end of the country, or the trip to Scotland or Devon or whatever once a year, plus maybe a couple of other business trips or something like that, if you look at your miles over the year, they will have disproportionately consumed a huge amount. The interesting thing about that with respect to car travel is that a lot of people buy their car with the image of the family holiday in mind when they go to buy it. So the boot space requirement, therefore, often dictating the size of the car, etc., and all the other sort of ancillary bits and bobs in the car is dictated by these 2% of journeys that they do a year, rather than the daily usage of those cars. So there's a whole other conversation about what that means.
Thank you. Valentine, very quickly, do you see a role for the voluntary sector, for the private sector, in driving this urban transition, looking at the distribution of where those cities were, where the capacities were? You have 1 minute.
Okay, I'll keep it quick. Yes, I definitely do see a big role for the private sector. If you read, for instance, the Climate Change Committee latest report, they were saying that a lot of the sort of massive investment we need to get to net zero will not just be from government and public sector, but also from businesses. But I think it's interesting to reflect on the interaction between the two, and the fact that public policies need to steer private investment, in a sense that they need to send a strong signal for private investment to happen. And when you look at what happened in both transport and housing, you can see it's been very different in these 2 cases. For instance, on transport, we have very clear signals that petrol cars and diesel cars will be banned by 2035. We also know, there's a whole list of policies that create certainty for the private sector to therefore invest in. If you look at the housing sector, it's much less clear. So the whole Green Homes Grant sort of fiasco, and the fact that, the reason why it didn't work eventually is because the private sector didn't have much time to prepare at scale, and therefore didn't have much incentives to do so. So there's, I think, an interesting conversation here, which we don't have time to have, about the sort of relationship between the public and private sector.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for some amazing presentations, delivered as expected, the standard and the quality and the impact. And I guess it's Andy Burnham next. So thank you, everyone. Cheers. Thanks for the speakers.